The courthouse was alive with a low, restless energy. The marble floors echoed with the footsteps of lawyers and nervous defendants, while the sharp click of heels announced every late arrival. Sunlight spilled through tall windows, painting long stripes across the polished wood benches. Amelia Warren stepped quietly into the building, her presence calm and composed. She wore a simple black dress under a tailored coat, her hair neatly tied back. In her hands, she carried a slim leather folder, nothing more. She moved through the crowd with quiet purpose. Most didn't notice her, but the few who did glanced twice, not because of her appearance, but because of the way she carried herself. Near the entrance to the courtroom, Officer Brad Thompson leaned casually against the wall. His badge glinted under the fluorescent lights. He scanned the people entering with a look of mild disdain, like a gatekeeper deciding who belonged and who didn't. When his eyes landed on Amelia, his brow furrowed slightly. She didn't look like the type of person he expected to see there. Not in this courtroom, not in this neighborhood. "Ma'am," he said, stepping in front of her, "this area is for official business only. You can wait outside with the public." Amelia's gaze met his evenly. Her voice was soft but firm. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Brad smirked faintly, folding his arms. "Right. And who exactly are you here for? Family? Friend?" "I'm here for the proceedings," Amelia replied calmly. Brad shook his head. "Yeah, not happening. You can't just walk in without clearance. Let's go." He gestured toward the hallway. "I have clearance," Amelia said, her tone still measured. Brad's smirk widened. "Sure you do. Got a badge hiding somewhere I don't see?" "No," she said simply, "but I don't need one." Brad stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen, I'm not going to say this twice. You don't belong in there. Out." Amelia didn't flinch. "Officer, you're making a mistake." Brad straightened, puffing out his chest slightly. "No mistake. My job's to keep this courtroom clear of people who don't have business being here. And you're done." He stepped to the side and gestured toward the exit. "Move along." Amelia paused for a moment, studying him quietly. Then she spoke, her words calm but edged with something sharper. "I suggest you reconsider," she said softly, "because in about 5 minutes you'll realize exactly how wrong you are." Brad chuckled. "Right, 5 minutes. Sure." He didn't know yet that those 5 minutes would change everything for him. Brad didn't move from his spot in front of the courtroom doors. He crossed his arms, a smug look spreading across his face as if he had already won some silent power struggle. Amelia, however, didn't argue or plead. She simply stood there, calm and unshaken, as if she had seen this scene play out 1,000 times before. "Look," Brad said, lowering his voice just slightly, "I don't know what you think you're here for, but this isn't your space. There are rules. You can watch from the public gallery if you really want, but you're not stepping past this door." Amelia tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "You're enforcing rules you don't even understand. You're guarding a door without knowing who you're keeping out." Brad scoffed. "Lady, I know enough. Trust me. I can tell who's who in a place like this." Her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. Cold, almost pitying. "No," she said softly. "You really can't." Before Brad could respond, the heavy wooden courtroom doors swung open. A clerk stepped out, carrying a thick folder of documents. He glanced at Amelia, then immediately straightened. "Ms. Warren," the clerk said, his tone respectful. "We've been expecting you. The judge is ready." Brad froze. "What?" The clerk looked at him briefly, confused. "She's needed inside. Now." Amelia didn't even look at Brad as she stepped forward. "Thank you," she said to the clerk, her voice steady. Brad moved instinctively to block her again, but the clerk shot him a sharp look. "Officer, step aside. Do you have any idea who you're speaking to?" Brad blinked, his confidence faltering for the first time. She didn't say. She didn't have to," the clerk interrupted. "This is Ms. Amelia Warren. She's presiding over today's case." The color drained from Brad's face. He stared at Amelia, truly seeing her for the first time, not as someone out of place, not as a stranger, but as someone with more authority in this building than he could ever claim. Amelia turned her gaze toward him, her expression unreadable. "I told you you'd realize your mistake," she said quietly. Brad stepped back, suddenly awkward, his voice caught in his throat. I didn't know." Amelia's eyes were calm but sharp. "You didn't need to know my title to treat me with respect. That's the part you still don't understand." With that, she stepped past him and entered the courtroom. Inside, the room stood still as Amelia walked to the front. Lawyers and attendees rose slightly in acknowledgement as she took her place at the bench. The quiet power she carried now filled the room completely. Brad lingered in the hallway, still processing what had just happened. In mere seconds, the authority he thought he held had crumbled, replaced by a cold, creeping regret that settled heavy in his chest. And the day was only beginning. The courtroom settled into silence as Amelia Warren took her place at the bench. She placed the slim leather folder in front of her, adjusted her glasses, and glanced briefly at the lawyers who stood ready for the day's hearing. Her presence was calm, composed, but undeniably commanding. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. Everyone stood. Even from the hallway, Brad could hear the shift in tone, the respect in every movement. He leaned slightly toward the open door, his stomach twisting as he watched the woman he had tried to dismiss take her rightful seat at the head of the room. "Be seated," Amelia said, her voice measured but firm. The proceedings began. Lawyers approached with their opening statements, speaking carefully under her steady gaze. She listened without interruption, jotting quiet notes on the papers before her. Every motion she made was deliberate, confident, unmistakable authority in action. From the hallway, Brad felt like the ground had dropped out from under him. The whispers had started among the court staff. "Did you see what just happened? Officer Thompson tried to stop Judge Warren from entering." Judge. The word repeated in Brad's head, each time heavier than before. Inside, Amelia kept her composure as if nothing had happened moments ago. She wasn't going to give Brad the satisfaction of a public reprimand. No, her silence was louder than anything she could have said. During a short recess, Amelia stepped into the judge's chambers. She set down her papers and took a quiet breath, allowing herself a brief moment of reflection. She'd experienced prejudice before, in quieter ways and louder ones. But it still struck her each time how quickly someone could assume who she was, and more importantly, who she wasn't. Meanwhile, in the hallway, Brad stood stiffly, unsure of what to do. A fellow officer approached him. "What's going on? Why are you out here?" Brad's voice was flat, almost hollow. "I made a mistake." The officer frowned, What do you mean? Brad didn't answer. He couldn't bring himself to admit out loud that he had tried to throw a judge out of her own courtroom. As the recess ended, Amelia returned to the bench, her calm expression betraying nothing. But before resuming, she spoke quietly to the bailiff. "Bring Officer Thompson inside," she said. A ripple of curiosity moved through the room. Moments later, Brad was escorted into the courtroom. He felt every eye on him as he stood there, suddenly small in a space he usually felt control over. Amelia's gaze met his, not with anger, but with something sharper: disappointment. "Officer Thompson," she said evenly, her voice carrying through the silent room, "I believe you have something to learn about where authority begins and where it ends." Brad's throat tightened. "Yes, Your Honor," he managed to say. Amelia didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "We'll address this after the hearing. For now, take a seat and watch carefully." Brad sat in the back, his regret growing heavier with every passing second, as he realized the full weight of the mistake he had made. And the day was far from over. Brad sat stiffly at the back of the courtroom, his uniform suddenly feeling heavier than it ever had before. He tried to keep his expression neutral, but he could feel the eyes of the clerks, the lawyers, even the spectators flicking toward him with quiet curiosity. The whispers hadn't stopped. Everyone in the building now knew exactly what had happened at the door. At the bench, Amelia resumed the hearing. Her voice was calm, measured, each ruling delivered with quiet precision. The lawyers presented their arguments. Witnesses were sworn in. And the usual rhythm of the courtroom continued. Except now Brad was hyper-aware of every word, every gesture. He watched her closely. The way she commanded the room without raising her voice. The way even the most seasoned attorneys approached her with careful respect. It was a kind of authority he had never truly understood before. For the first time, Brad saw the difference between power and dignity. During another short recess, Amelia gathered her papers and stepped into her chambers. Brad stayed seated, unsure if he should leave, unsure if he even could. One of the clerks passed by and gave him a pointed look. "She's not someone you want to cross," the clerk murmured. "You're lucky she's the kind who believes in teaching lessons, not just ending careers." Brad didn't respond. He just nodded slightly, feeling the weight of those words settle. When the court resumed, the hearing wrapped up smoothly. Amelia signed the final documents, then looked up from the bench. "Before we adjourn," she said, her tone carrying an unmistakable edge, "I need to address an incident that occurred earlier today outside this very courtroom." The room went silent. Brad's stomach tightened as Amelia's eyes briefly shifted toward him. "This courthouse," she continued, "is a place where justice is meant to begin, not end. And yet, even in a building devoted to fairness, we are reminded that bias can walk through the door wearing a uniform." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Brad lowered his gaze. "I will not name the individual involved," Amelia said firmly, "because this lesson is not about public shame. It is about understanding. Every person who enters this building deserves respect, whether they are here as a defendant, a witness, a clerk, or even a judge." Her words hung in the air like a weight. She didn't need to call him out directly. Everyone already knew. This court stands as a reminder that titles do not define worth. Humanity does, she finished, her voice calm but cutting. She tapped her gavel once. Court is adjourned. The sound echoed through the chamber. People began to gather their things, whispering quietly as they filed out. Brad stayed seated, frozen. He knew this wasn't over. As the courtroom emptied, the bailiff approached. "Judge Warren would like to see you in chambers," he said. Brad stood slowly, his heart pounding. He followed the bailiff toward the door behind the bench, each step feeling heavier than the last. And for the first time in years, Brad felt something unfamiliar in his chest. Not just regret, but humility. The bailiff opened the door to the judge's chambers, gesturing for Brad to enter. The room was quiet, lined with shelves of thick law books and a single large desk. Amelia sat behind it, reviewing a document with calm precision. She didn't look up immediately. Brad stood awkwardly near the door, his hat in his hands. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, Amelia set down the paper and raised her eyes to meet his. Her gaze was steady, unflinching. "Officer Thompson," she began, her voice calm but edged with quiet authority. "Do you understand why you're standing here?" "Yes, Your Honor," Brad said quietly. "Tell me," she said, leaning back slightly. "Why are you here?" Brad swallowed hard. "Because I stopped you from entering the courtroom. I assumed you didn't belong there." "You assumed," Amelia repeated softly, her tone sharp without rising in volume. "You didn't ask. You didn't verify. You decided." Brad nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She studied him for a moment, then stood. Her presence was commanding even in the small room. "Officer, what gave you the right to decide who belongs in this courthouse? Did my appearance? My skin? My silence? Tell me." Brad hesitated, the truth hard to admit aloud. "It was my own bias," he said finally, voice low. "I didn't think. I acted on it." Amelia stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person who has walked through those doors and been made to feel small before they even speak. Do you understand the weight of that?" Brad met her gaze, shame flickering in his eyes. "I do now." She held his stare for a long, quiet moment. "You humiliated yourself today, not because you didn't know my title, but because you didn't see my humanity first. That's the lesson you need to learn." Brad lowered his head. "I'm sorry, Judge Warren. I truly am." Amelia turned back to her desk. Sorry doesn't erase what happened, but it can mean something if it's followed by change. She paused, then added, "You have a choice, Officer Thompson. You can leave this room the same as you walked in, or you can walk out and begin the hard work of seeing differently." "Which will it be?" Brad's voice was steadier this time. "I want to change. I don't want this to be who I am." Amelia gave a single nod. "Then start by listening, by learning, and by never forgetting that the power you carry with that badge is supposed to protect, not diminish." Brad straightened slightly. "Yes, Your Honor." "Dismissed," she said simply. As he left the chambers, the hallway outside felt different, heavier somehow. The whispers had faded, replaced by the lingering weight of her words. For the first time in a long time, Brad didn't feel like an officer walking out of a judge's chambers. He felt like a man forced to look at himself clearly and realizing he didn't like what he saw. Brad stepped out of the judge's chambers, feeling strangely hollow. The echo of Amelia's words followed him down the hallway. "You didn't see my humanity first." It was a truth that struck deeper than any reprimand he'd ever received. He walked past clerks and attorneys who barely looked his way, but he felt the weight of their quiet judgment. Every step down the courthouse corridor felt like it carried more gravity than it had that morning. Outside, the sunlight was blinding after the dim interior. Brad paused on the courthouse steps, gripping the railing tightly. For years, his badge had been his shield, something he wore with pride, something he thought gave him clarity. But now, it felt like a mirror, reflecting the flaws he could no longer deny. Meanwhile, Amelia returned to the bench for the afternoon session. She appeared unshaken, but inside she carried the frustration of how familiar this kind of moment was. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated her, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. Yet she never let it show in her rulings, her voice, or her face. Her power came from restraint, from never letting someone else's ignorance dictate her grace. Later in the day, Brad sat in his patrol car, parked on a quiet street. He didn't turn the engine on. He didn't even reach for the radio. He just sat there, staring at his reflection in the side mirror. He thought about all the other faces he might have dismissed over the years, all the people who never had a title or a connection to stop his assumptions. The thought made his chest tighten. Across town, Amelia visited a small cafe after court. She sat by the window, sipping tea and reviewing notes for the next day's cases. A young woman approached her timidly. "Judge Warren?" the woman asked softly. Amelia looked up. "Yes? I just wanted to say thank you. The way you run your courtroom. It makes people feel like they matter. I noticed it today." Amelia offered a small smile. "Everyone matters. That's the point." The woman nodded gratefully and walked away. Later that evening, Brad returned home. He removed his badge and set it on the kitchen table. For the first time, it didn't feel like a symbol of authority. It felt like a responsibility he hadn't lived up to. He sat there in silence, his thoughts circling the same question over and over. How many times have I failed to see? Amelia, at the same hour, sat in her quiet living room. She opened her leather folder and slid out an old photo, a picture of her early days as a young attorney, full of determination. She had always known the road to respect would be harder for her, but she had also known she would never stop walking it. 2 different homes, 2 different reflections, and both of them thinking about how one moment at a courtroom door had changed everything. The next morning, the courthouse was quieter than usual. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows, creating a steady rhythm that filled the marble halls. Amelia arrived early, as she always did, carrying her slim leather folder. She moved with quiet confidence, her heels echoing softly on the polished floors. As she walked through the hallway, people greeted her respectfully. A young clerk held the door open and whispered, "Good morning, Judge Warren." "Good morning," Amelia replied with a faint smile. She never showed the weight she carried, but she felt it every day. Across town, Brad sat in his car outside the precinct. He was still replaying the previous day in his mind, haunted by the moment he had stopped Amelia at the courtroom door. But even more haunting was the thought of how many other times he'd made similar assumptions, moments that never came back to confront him like this one had. His partner, Officer Davis, knocked on the window. "Hey, you coming in?" Brad shook his head. "Not yet." Davis frowned. You good? You've been different lately. I'm thinking, Brad said simply, about how I've been doing this job, about how I've been seeing people. Davis raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. All right, don't think too hard. You'll hurt yourself, he joked, trying to lighten the mood. But Brad didn't laugh. Meanwhile, Amelia presided over another case. Inside the courtroom, she maintained her calm authority. But during a recess, she stepped into her chambers and allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. She thought of Brad, not with anger, but with a quiet sense of clarity. She had seen men like him countless times, men who wielded authority without truly understanding the responsibility it carried. But this time had been different. She had seen regret in his eyes. And sometimes, regret was the first step toward change. Later that day, Brad found himself outside the Youth Outreach Center. He had started volunteering there quietly, without telling anyone. He spent the afternoon helping teenagers with their community projects, listening more than he spoke. One boy asked him, "Why are you here? Aren't you a cop?" Brad nodded slowly. "I am, and I'm here because I want to be better at it, better than I've been." The boy studied him for a moment before shrugging. "Guess everyone can learn?" Brad smiled faintly. "Yeah, everyone can." That evening, Amelia stopped by a small cafe near the courthouse. As she sat by the window with a cup of tea, she saw Brad walking past outside. Their eyes met for a brief second through the glass. He paused, unsure if he should come in, but Amelia gave a subtle nod, acknowledging him without a word. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't friendship. It was simply a recognition that he was trying. Brad nodded back, then continued walking. And in that quiet, fleeting moment, both understood something deeper. Real change wasn't loud. It was quiet, slow, and built on choices made every day after the mistake. Brad kept walking after that brief exchange through the cafe window. The look in Amelia's eyes wasn't one of anger. It was steadier than that. It carried quiet weight, the kind that made you think twice about who you were and what you stood for. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't condemnation either. It was something in between, something that felt like a challenge to do better. He walked past the courthouse and stopped near the steps, staring at the entrance where everything had begun. The memory of blocking Amelia at the door replayed in his mind, sharper than ever. He thought of how certain he'd been in that moment, how easily he'd let assumptions guide his actions. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Amelia finished her last case of the day. The gallery emptied slowly as she gathered her papers, placing them neatly into her folder. The room grew quiet except for the faint echo of her heels against the floor. "Judge Warren?" a young clerk asked hesitantly, approaching her. "Yes?" The clerk shifted nervously. People were talking about what happened with the officer at the door. Some of us, we've seen that kind of thing before. But the way you handled it, calm, without humiliating him, it made us realize there's another way to hold someone accountable. Amelia gave a small nod. Dignity isn't just for those who deserve it. It's for everyone, even when they fail, especially then. The clerk nodded, clearly moved by her words. Later that afternoon, Brad returned to the youth center again. He was slowly becoming a familiar face there. This time, he sat with a group of kids working on a mural for the community room. "Andre," The boy who had once questioned why Brad kept coming back handed him a paintbrush. "You're still here," Andre said, almost surprised. Brad gave a faint smile. "I said I would be." The kids worked in silence for a while, filling the blank wall with color. One girl glanced at Brad and asked, "You ever mess up really bad?" Brad paused before answering. "Yeah, I did. And it made me realize I'd been looking at people the wrong way. Now I'm trying to fix that. But fixing it takes time." The girl nodded thoughtfully. "At least you're trying. Some people don't." That night, Amelia walked home after a long day. She paused at the courthouse steps, looking up at the grand columns bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. She thought of how many stories those walls had witnessed, moments of justice and moments of failure. Across the city, Brad sat at his kitchen table, the badge lying in front of him once again. He stared at it for a long time, not with pride, but with a quiet determination. Both of them, in different corners of the same city, were thinking about the same lesson: that real justice doesn't end in a courtroom. It begins in the way we choose to see one another. And for the first time, Brad felt like he was finally starting to see. The following morning, the city was washed in soft, golden light. Amelia arrived early at the courthouse once again. As always, she walked with quiet purpose, acknowledging the clerks and staff who greeted her respectfully. When she reached the main hallway, she paused for a brief moment near the spot where Brad had stopped her days ago. It was almost symbolic now, a reminder of how quickly people decided who belonged. She didn't linger, but the memory stayed with her as she stepped through the courtroom doors. Meanwhile, Brad was at the Youth Outreach Center again. He'd begun arriving before the kids, helping the staff set up for the day. He no longer wore his badge here. It felt out of place in a space meant for rebuilding trust. Today, Andre sat across from him at a table, flipping through a notebook. "So," the boy said casually, "are you still a cop or what?" Brad hesitated. "I am, for now, but I'm also someone who's learning what that really means." Andre raised an eyebrow. "You mean you're learning not to be a jerk?" Brad actually smiled faintly. "Yeah, that too." The kids laughed, but there was no malice in it. Slowly, the walls between them were coming down. Later that day, Amelia presided over another case. During a recess, one of the lawyers approached her cautiously. "Judge Warren, if you don't mind me saying, people have been talking about how you handled that officer at the door. Most would have humiliated him on the spot." Amelia looked up from her notes. "Humiliation doesn't teach. It only hardens people. Sometimes silence speaks louder than anger." The lawyer nodded thoughtfully before stepping away. That afternoon, Brad decided to walk past the courthouse after leaving the youth center. He didn't plan to go inside. He just wanted to see it again. As he approached, he noticed Amelia descending the courthouse steps. For a brief moment, he froze, unsure if he should say anything. But Amelia looked up and saw him. Their eyes met again, and for the second time, he felt that same steady calm in her gaze. He stepped closer, speaking quietly. "Judge Warren, I just wanted to say, I'm still trying. I'm volunteering, listening, doing what I can. It's not much, but it's a start." Amelia studied him for a moment before replying. "It's never about how much. It's about whether the effort is honest." "It is." Brad said softly. She gave a small nod, her expression unreadable, but not unkind. Then keep going. Change doesn't happen all at once. It happens in the days after the mistake. With that, she stepped past him, continuing toward the street. Brad watched her go, feeling a strange mix of humility and resolve. He knew she didn't owe him acknowledgement, but that simple nod felt like a weight and a gift at the same time. As the evening settled over the city, Amelia returned home, placing her folder on the table. She glanced out the window, thinking about how even the smallest interactions could ripple outward in ways no one expected. And across the city, Brad sat quietly in his car, realizing for the first time that regret wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The days began to settle into a quiet rhythm. Amelia continued her work at the courthouse, maintaining her calm authority in every case she presided over. To those around her, she seemed unchanged, steady, composed, unshaken. But in her private thoughts, she reflected often on how easily the courtroom door could have become a barrier rather than an entrance. She thought about how many others had faced the same bias, but without the power or title to turn the moment into a lesson. That thought stayed with her more than Brad's words ever could. Meanwhile, Brad kept returning to the youth center. It had become a place of reflection for him, a space where he could unlearn the habits he'd carried for years. He spent his afternoons helping the kids with schoolwork, listening to their stories, and sometimes just sitting quietly with them. One day, Andre approached him while they were organizing supplies. "So, do you think people like you can really change?" the boy asked bluntly. Brad paused, looking at the teenager. "I think we have to, not all at once. Not perfectly, but if we don't try, then nothing changes for anyone." Andre nodded slowly, as if considering his answer. "I guess trying's better than nothing." Later that week, Brad received an official notice from the department. It detailed the disciplinary measures from his hearing: mandatory retraining, a public apology at the courthouse, and a 6-month reassignment to community work. He sat at his kitchen table, reading it carefully. It wasn't the end of his career, but it was far from a free pass. And he knew he'd earned every consequence. Across town, Amelia prepared for another long day in court. She gathered her folder, slipped on her coat, and paused briefly at the mirror. For a fleeting second, she saw the young woman she had once been, fighting to be heard in rooms where her voice was doubted. She exhaled slowly and left her home. That afternoon, Brad stood on the courthouse steps, preparing for the public statement the department required. A small crowd of reporters and staff had gathered. He stepped up to the microphone, his voice steady but quiet. "I'm here because I failed to see someone for who they were. I let my assumptions guide my actions, and I disrespected not just a person, but the very idea of justice this building is supposed to represent. I can't take it back, but I can take responsibility. And I will spend every day moving forward, proving I can do better." The reporters scribbled notes, some skeptical, some surprised by the honesty. Inside the courthouse, Amelia listened from her chambers. She didn't smile or react outwardly, but she heard the sincerity in his words. She knew words weren't enough, but they were a beginning. That evening, as the courthouse emptied and the city lights began to glow, Amelia walked out past the same doors where Brad had once stopped her. And for the first time since that day, she allowed herself a quiet moment of hope. Because sometimes The smallest shift in perspective could plant the seeds for something far greater than anyone could see. The courthouse steps were nearly empty after Brad's statement. A few reporters lingered, exchanging quiet notes before heading off to file their stories. Brad stood for a moment, feeling the weight of what he had just said. There was no applause, no reassurance, just the cold reality of accountability settling deeper into his bones. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing softly in the quiet evening. For the first time, he felt lighter, not because he had been forgiven, but because he had finally spoken the truth out loud. Inside the courthouse, Amelia finished signing the last of the day's rulings. She closed her leather folder, took a breath, and stepped out into the fading light. From a distance, she saw Brad leaving the steps, his shoulders slightly slumped, his pace slower than usual. She didn't call out to him. She didn't need to. Some lessons were meant to stay silent. Later that evening, Amelia visited a small community event hosted by the Veterans Center. She sat with Carl and a few other young advocates who were beginning to organize forums about equity in public spaces. Carl leaned in and whispered, "Did you hear about the officer? He made a public apology." "I did," Amelia said calmly. "Do you think it'll matter?" Carl asked, a trace of doubt in his voice. Amelia looked at him steadily. "It matters if it's followed by action. Words alone fade, but change comes in the days after." Meanwhile, Brad spent the night at the Youth Outreach Center again. After helping with cleanup, he sat in the quiet common room with Andre. The boy studied him curiously. "You really think people will believe you're different now?" Andre asked. Brad hesitated, then answered honestly. "Maybe not right away, maybe never, but believing it isn't the point. Living it is." Andre tilted his head slightly. "Guess you'll just have to show it." Brad nodded. "Yeah, I will." As the week went on, Brad began his mandatory retraining. It wasn't just about procedures. It included classes on bias, de-escalation, and community engagement. For the first time in his career, he sat in a room where he wasn't the authority figure. He listened, truly listened, to the voices of people who had been on the other side of the badge. At the same time, Amelia continued her work in court, but she also began quietly meeting with local leaders to discuss how the courthouse could be made more welcoming for everyone. She didn't announce these meetings publicly. She believed in working steadily behind the scenes. One evening, as the sun set, Amelia passed by the park memorial near the courthouse. To her surprise, she saw Brad there, standing alone, reading the engraved names in silence. She didn't approach him. She simply watched for a moment. And in that quiet moment, she understood he was still learning. Then she turned and walked away, leaving him to his reflection. Because true change didn't need an audience. It needed persistence. Brad stayed at the memorial long after the sun dipped below the horizon. The soft glow of the lamplight illuminated the engraved names, each one a reminder of lives dedicated to service, sacrifice, and dignity. He traced one of the names gently with his fingertips, thinking about the people he had overlooked in his own life, the faces he had reduced to quick judgments without truly seeing them. It wasn't just about Judge Warren anymore. She had become the moment that cracked something open inside him, forcing him to see beyond the badge. But now, he realized there were countless others he had dismissed who would never have the chance to stand before him with titles or recognition. The next morning, Amelia prepared for another long day in court. She glanced briefly at her reflection in the mirror before leaving. She always carried herself with poise, but in the quiet moments, she allowed herself to feel the fatigue of constantly proving her place in rooms that should have already welcomed her. At the courthouse, she greeted the staff warmly. There were no whispers today, no lingering stares. The building had returned to its usual rhythm, but Amelia knew that beneath the surface, her interaction with Brad had left an impression on everyone who witnessed it. Later that day, Brad attended another retraining session with other suspended officers. The instructor, a retired community advocate, spoke plainly. Bias doesn't announce itself. It hides in your instincts. It shows in how fast you assume someone's worth. The job isn't about ignoring it. It's about confronting it. Brad listened intently. For once, he wasn't defensive. He wrote down notes, reflecting deeply on each word. After the session, one of the other officers muttered under his breath, "This is a waste of time. People are too sensitive these days." Brad looked at him quietly and replied, "No, this is exactly what we should have been doing all along." That evening, Amelia visited the community forum being planned by Carl and other young advocates. She didn't sit at the front or take the microphone. She simply observed, offering quiet support. When the meeting ended, Carl approached her with a hopeful expression. "We're planning to invite officers too," he said, "if they'll come." "They will," Amelia said softly. "Some of them already started their journey." Meanwhile, Brad left the youth center late. As he walked to his car, Andre caught up to him. "You're still coming back tomorrow, right?" the boy asked. "Yes," Brad said, "as long as you'll have me here." Andre gave a small nod. "We will." Back at home, Brad placed his badge on the table again. This time, it didn't feel like it was mocking him. It felt like a reminder of the work ahead. Work he finally understood wasn't about control, but about responsibility. And across town, Amelia sat on her porch under the soft glow of the streetlights. She thought about how one moment at a courthouse door had rippled outward, touching lives beyond what anyone could see. Change was still slow. It always would be. But it had begun. The next week unfolded quietly, but the effects of that one moment continued to ripple. At the courthouse, people spoke less openly about the incident, but their behavior shifted subtly. Clerks were more attentive. Officers posted at the doors took a second look at themselves before stopping someone without cause. The lesson had lingered, even without Amelia ever naming Brad publicly. Amelia noticed it in small ways. The greetings felt warmer, less performative. The stares that once held quiet doubt seemed to soften. She didn't fool herself into thinking everything had changed overnight, but she knew seeds had been planted. Meanwhile, Brad immersed himself fully in community work. At the youth center, he helped organize a mentorship program that paired teenagers with local professionals. He didn't just show up. He stayed late, cleaned up, and listened when they spoke. One afternoon, Andre pulled him aside. "You know, people talk about you," the boy said. Brad raised an eyebrow. "Good or bad?" "Both," Andre shrugged. "Some think you're just trying to look good after messing up. Others think you're serious about this." Brad nodded slowly. "They're right to question it. I can't change what I did. I can only keep showing I'm not that man anymore." Andre smirked slightly. "Guess we'll see if you mean it." "I guess you will," Brad replied quietly. Later that day, Amelia met with a group of community leaders at the courthouse. They were discussing new initiatives to build trust between the court, the police, and the neighborhoods they served. "We need voices from every side," one leader said, "including law enforcement. Someone who's willing to admit what's broken." Amelia thought for a moment. "I know someone," she said simply. That evening, Brad received a message from the youth center director. It was brief. "Judge Warren wants to know if you'll join a discussion panel on bridging trust between communities and law enforcement." Brad stared at the message for a long time. His first instinct was to say no. He didn't deserve to sit on any panel. But then he remembered Amelia's words in Chambers. "You can leave the same as you walked in, or you can begin the hard work of seeing differently." He replied, "Yes, I'll be there." The day of the panel came quickly. It was held at the same community center where Brad had been volunteering. Chairs were set in neat rows, and the room filled with residents, advocates, and officers. Amelia sat on the stage beside Carl, who would open the discussion. Brad sat in the back, waiting quietly until he was introduced. When it was his turn to speak, he walked slowly to the front, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. "I'm not here to defend myself," Brad began. "I'm here because I failed, and because I refused to let that failure be the end of my story." The room stayed silent, waiting for what would come next. Brad stood at the front of the room, the microphone in his hand feeling heavier than it should. Rows of faces stared back at him, some curious, some skeptical, others openly guarded. He took a breath before continuing. "I was the officer who stopped Judge Warren outside the courthouse," he said plainly. A few murmurs rippled through the audience. "I didn't know who she was, and that's exactly the point. I shouldn't have needed to, but I let my assumptions speak louder than my duty." He paused, scanning the crowd. "For years, I thought wearing a badge meant I always knew what was right. I thought my instincts were enough. But they weren't. That day showed me how easily I could fail someone, and how many times I might have failed before without even realizing it." In the front row, Amelia watched him silently. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes were focused. Brad continued, his voice steady but low. "I can't erase what I did. I can't undo the hurt I caused, but I can take responsibility. I can listen more, judge less, and use whatever time I have left in this job to do better than I have before." The room stayed quiet, but the silence wasn't cold. It was thoughtful. After Brad stepped down, Carl took the microphone. The young veteran spoke about what it felt like to return home from service only to face suspicion from the very people meant to protect the community. He spoke of feeling unseen, unheard. His words connected with the crowd, making the issue larger than just one officer and one moment. Amelia closed the panel. She didn't call out Brad directly, nor did she soften the reality of the harm caused. Instead, she left the audience with a clear message. "Accountability isn't about punishment alone," she said. "It's about growth. It's about what happens the day after the mistake and every day after that. We can't change the past, but we can change the future, together, if we're willing to face the truth." After the event, people approached Amelia to thank her. A few even approached Brad, not to congratulate him, but to quietly acknowledge that showing up mattered. Outside the center, Brad stood by himself, breathing in the cool evening air. He felt both lighter and heavier, lighter for speaking the truth, heavier for knowing the work was just beginning. Amelia stepped outside a few minutes later. She saw him standing there but didn't walk over immediately. Instead, she paused and observed him from a distance. When their eyes met, she gave a small nod, the same kind of quiet acknowledgement she'd given before. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't final. But it was a sign that he was on the path he needed to be. Brad nodded back. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. As they went their separate ways, the street was quiet, the city settling into the soft glow of twilight. The lesson was still unfolding, and both of them knew it wouldn't end here. The days after the panel felt subtly different. The community center became a place of ongoing conversation, not just about what had happened with Amelia and Brad, but about deeper issues that had been simmering quietly for years. People began sharing their own experiences, stories of being dismissed, overlooked, or treated as though they didn't belong. Amelia returned to her regular schedule at the courthouse, but she noticed the shift. Officers at the door greeted people with more care. Clerks seemed more deliberate in their actions. It wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable. Small ripples of change had begun to move outward. Meanwhile, Brad continued volunteering at the youth center. He helped organize an art project that allowed the kids to express how they saw their community. Some painted hopeful murals. Others painted fractured images that reflected the reality they still felt every day. Andre showed Brad a painting he'd been working on, a set of hands reaching through bars of light. "What's this mean?" Brad asked. Andre shrugged. "It's like there's hope, but it's still locked up. People can see it, but they can't reach it yet." Brad looked at the boy, realizing how much wisdom lived in those simple words. "Maybe it just takes someone to open the door," he said quietly. Andre glanced up. "Maybe, but only if they really want to." That same afternoon, Amelia received a letter at her chambers. It was from a community member who had been in the courtroom the day Brad stopped her. "I watched how you handled that moment, Judge Warren. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't embarrass him. You showed what real strength looks like. It made me rethink how I react to people in my own life." She folded the letter neatly and placed it in her drawer. It reminded her why she chose calm over chaos, even when anger would have been justified. Later that week, Brad received confirmation of his new assignment. For the next 6 months, he would serve exclusively in community outreach programs and retraining sessions. It wasn't a demotion. It was a redirection. A chance to prove his growth through actions, not words. That evening, he walked past the courthouse. The same doors where he'd once stood with arrogance now felt entirely different. He paused, looking up at the grand columns, feeling a quiet humility wash over him. Inside, Amelia was finishing her day's work. She saw him through the window and recognized the shift in his posture. Less rigid, less guarded. Neither waved, neither smiled. But for a fleeting second, they understood each other without a single word. As Brad walked away into the dim evening light, Amelia closed her folder and turned off the lamp in her chambers. 2 lives had crossed in conflict. Now, they moved forward in parallel, not as friends, but as reminders to one another that change, though quiet, was possible. And in a world that often judged too quickly, that quiet was where the real work began. The next morning, Amelia arrived at the courthouse early as always. The sun had barely risen, casting long beams of pale gold through the tall windows. She paused briefly at the entrance, looking at the familiar marble steps that had witnessed so many stories, some just, some not. Inside, the atmosphere was calmer than usual. People moved with quiet purpose, their voices hushed, as though the building itself was demanding more thoughtfulness. Amelia greeted the clerks with a nod before retreating to her chambers to review the day's cases. Meanwhile, across town, Brad stood in a classroom at the police academy. As part of his retraining, he had been asked to share his story with new recruits. He hesitated at first, unsure if exposing his failure would mean anything to them. But when he faced the room of fresh-faced officers, he spoke plainly. "I made a mistake," Brad began. "Not a paperwork mistake, a human one. I let my bias decide who someone was before I even gave them a chance. It cost me more than my pride. It cost me my integrity. Don't wait until it's too late to see people for who they really are." The recruits listened silently, some clearly uncomfortable, but a few nodded, their expressions thoughtful. Later that day, Brad stopped by the youth center once again. He helped the kids finish their mural, the one Andre had described as hope locked behind bars of light. They were now adding vibrant colors to the gaps between the bars, turning it into something brighter. "Looks different now," Brad said, studying the wall. Andre smirked. "Yeah, we decided to open it up." Brad smiled faintly. "Sometimes that's all it takes, opening it up." Meanwhile, Amelia was finishing a hearing when a young attorney lingered after the session. "Judge Warren," the attorney said, "I just wanted to say, I saw how you handled that situation with the officer last week. It taught me that real authority doesn't have to be loud to be powerful." Amelia nodded. "Authority without humility isn't strength. It's just noise." As the day wound down, Brad walked past the courthouse once again. He slowed near the steps, the place where everything had begun. From a distance, he saw Amelia leaving the building, her folder in hand, her posture as calm and composed as always. Their eyes met briefly, in passing. There was no conversation, no lingering stare, just a subtle acknowledgement that both had changed in their own ways. Brad continued down the street, heading toward the youth center. Amelia turned toward her car, ready to return home. The city moved on around them, but in small, quiet ways. Their encounter had shifted the way people saw one another, proof that sometimes the most profound changes don't announce themselves. They simply take root and grow. And as the evening light settled over the courthouse, both knew the real work was only just beginning. The following week unfolded with the same steady rhythm. Amelia continued her work in the courtroom, issuing rulings with her usual calm authority. Yet beneath the surface, she noticed small shifts, subtle but meaningful. The officers at the courthouse doors seemed more attentive, more deliberate with their words. The clerk spoke with an added layer of respect to everyone entering. It was a reminder that one moment, even a quiet one, could echo further than expected. Meanwhile, Brad was spending more of his time at the youth center. He'd begun mentoring some of the kids beyond the mural project, helping with schoolwork, and even organizing a small workshop on how to safely navigate interactions with law enforcement. "Why are you doing this?" one of the teens asked bluntly. Brad paused before answering. Because I've been on the other side of that badge, and I know what it feels like when someone doesn't see you. I can't undo the past, but I can help change what happens next. The teen nodded, still skeptical, but willing to listen. Later that day, Brad attended another retraining session for officers. This one was focused on implicit bias, led by a community activist who spoke with sharp clarity. Bias isn't just about what you think consciously, the instructor said. It's about what you've been taught to see without questioning it. The job is to stop, to think, to challenge yourself before you act, because your actions carry more weight than you realize. Brad wrote the words down, letting them sink in. Back at the courthouse, Amelia stayed late to review documents for an upcoming high-profile case. As the building emptied, she walked the quiet hallways alone. When she reached the entrance, she stopped for a moment, remembering the day Brad had blocked her path. She didn't feel anger anymore, just a calm resolve that such moments must be met with grace, but never forgotten. They were reminders of why the fight for fairness never truly ended. That evening, Brad visited the park memorial again. The lamplight glowed softly over the engraved names. This time, he brought a small bouquet of white flowers and placed them gently at the base of the stone. As he stood there, a passerby noticed. "You lose someone here?" the man asked kindly. Brad shook his head. "No, I'm just remembering someone who reminded me how to be better." The man gave a quiet nod and walked on. Across the city, Amelia sat on her porch, sipping tea under the fading light. She opened a small envelope that had arrived earlier in the day. A letter from the community forum organizers thanking her for her presence and leadership. She folded the letter and set it aside. For her, the true success wasn't in the thanks. It was in the small, silent changes happening in the hearts of people like Brad. Two lives had intersected for a brief, painful moment. Now, slowly and quietly, that moment was reshaping more than just the two of them. The next morning, the city was cloaked in a soft mist, the streets quieter than usual. Amelia arrived at the courthouse early, her heels echoing lightly on the marble floors. She greeted the security officers at the door, noticing how they now addressed every person entering with more care. It was subtle, but it meant something. Proof that change could start in small, almost invisible ways. Inside her chambers, Amelia reviewed the day's schedule. She had another packed docket, but her mind wandered briefly to the upcoming community discussion Carl had organized. She'd promised to attend, not as a judge, but as a listener and supporter. Meanwhile, Brad was at the youth center, preparing for a new workshop. This one was different. It paired officers with community members to talk openly about their experiences. Brad had volunteered to be one of the first officers to participate. When the room filled, there was an initial tension, an unspoken line dividing the two groups. But Brad spoke first, breaking the silence. "I'm not here to defend the badge," he said simply. "I'm here because I failed someone. That failure taught me how much listening matters. I'm here to listen now." Slowly, others began to share their stories. Times they'd felt invisible, unheard, dismissed. Brad didn't interrupt or explain away their pain. He just listened, really listened, for perhaps the first time in his career. Later that afternoon, Amelia stepped out of the courthouse for a brief walk. As she passed the steps where Brad had once stopped her, she noticed a small group of students on a tour. The guide was explaining the history of the courthouse, talking about justice and fairness. Amelia paused for a moment, reflecting on how those ideals often met reality in imperfect ways. Back at the youth center, the workshop ended with quiet handshakes and tentative smiles. One community member approached Brad afterward. "You're different than most I've met," the man said. Brad shook his head slightly. "I'm just trying to see better than I used to. That's all." As the day wound down, Brad found himself near the park memorial again. It had become a place of reflection for him, a reminder of humility. He stood there for a long moment, then pulled a small notebook from his pocket. Inside, he had started writing down lessons he wanted to carry forward. Not rules, not policies, but reminders about humanity. That same evening, Amelia arrived at the community center where Carl was setting up chairs for the upcoming forum. She walked quietly into the room and began helping him without saying a word. Carl glanced at her with a soft smile. "You always show up." Amelia replied calmly, "Showing up is where change begins." And across the city, Brad closed his notebook and looked up at the engraved names on the memorial one last time before heading home. Two different paths, two different lives, both quietly moving toward the same truth. That dignity, once recognized, changes everything. The evening of the community forum arrived with a quiet anticipation. The center buzzed with low conversation as people gathered, filling the rows of chairs. Some came out of curiosity, others out of hope. Amelia sat near the front, not in her usual position of authority, but among the community, blending in deliberately. Carl stood at the podium, welcoming everyone. His voice was steadier now, carrying a confidence he hadn't had before. "We're here tonight to talk about trust," he said. "Not the kind written in policies, but the kind built between people, one choice at a time." Brad was there too, seated at the side of the stage. He wasn't in uniform. He wanted the crowd to see him not as a symbol of the department, but simply as a man willing to face what he had done. When it was his turn, Brad walked slowly to the microphone. The room grew silent. "I know many of you don't trust people like me," he began, his voice even, "and I can't ask you to. Not after the years of hurt some of you have faced. But I'm here because one mistake forced me to see the truth I'd been ignoring for too long. I stopped someone at the courthouse, someone I dismissed without a second thought. And that moment showed me how much damage a single assumption can cause." He glanced at the crowd, then continued, "I don't want to be that man anymore. I can't erase what I did, but I can change what I do moving forward. That's why I'm here, not to talk at you, but to listen and learn." A few murmurs spread through the room. Some eyes softened, others stayed cautious. After Brad stepped down, a woman from the audience stood up. "We've heard promises before," she said, "but promises fade. Are you really willing to keep showing up?" Brad nodded. "Yes, as long as it takes." Amelia watched quietly. She didn't intervene, didn't add her own words. She simply observed the exchange, knowing that true accountability wasn't about her approval. It was about his continued effort. When the forum ended, people lingered in small groups, talking in hushed tones. Brad stayed behind, answering questions, listening to concerns. Carl approached Amelia, a faint smile on his face. "It feels like something's starting, doesn't it?" Amelia nodded. "It is, slowly. The best change always is." Outside, Brad stood alone for a moment, looking up at the darkening sky. The forum hadn't magically fixed anything. Trust wasn't built in a single evening, but it was a step forward, and that was enough to keep going. As the night settled over the city, Amelia walked past Brad on her way out. Their eyes met briefly. She gave him a small, quiet nod. No words, just acknowledgement, because sometimes the simplest gestures speak louder than anything else. The city was quiet the next morning, the streets bathed in a soft, golden haze. Amelia walked to the courthouse, as she always did, her steps measured, her mind clear. She had cases to hear, decisions to make, lives to impact. But in the back of her mind, she carried the memory of the forum, the voices of the community, the hesitant hope in their words, and the quiet determination she'd seen in Brad's eyes. Inside the courthouse, the staff moved with their usual rhythm. Yet Amelia noticed, again, how subtle changes were taking hold. Officers at the door greeted people with a little more care, their tone lighter, their presence less imposing. It was small, but small things mattered. Meanwhile, across town, Brad arrived early at the youth center. The mural project was finally complete. The once dark wall now filled with vibrant colors and images of hope. The hands that had once been trapped behind bars of light were now open, reaching toward a bright horizon. Andre stood beside Brad, looking at their work. "It's different now," the boy said. Brad nodded. "Yeah, it is. Feels lighter." Andre smirked. "Guess that means you're doing something right." Later that afternoon, Brad visited the park memorial for what had become a quiet ritual. He brought a single white flower and placed it at the base of the engraved stone. He didn't speak, didn't pray. He just stood there, letting the silence remind him of the humility he never wanted to lose again. As he turned to leave, he saw Amelia walking toward the courthouse from a distance. Their paths didn't cross, but for a brief moment, they were in the same place again. She noticed him standing by the memorial and slowed slightly, offering a small nod in acknowledgement. Brad nodded back. No words passed between them. There was no need. That evening, Amelia returned home and set her leather folder on the table. She made a cup of tea and stepped out onto her porch. The sky was streaked with the deep orange and pink of a fading sunset. She thought about the journey of the past weeks, the mistake, the confrontation, the quiet ripples of change that had followed. Across the city, Brad sat at his kitchen table with his badge in his hand. It didn't feel like a shield anymore. It felt like a promise. One he would carry forward differently now. For both of them, the encounter outside the courtroom had been brief, but it had reshaped far more than a single moment. It had changed the way Brad saw his duty. It had reaffirmed Amelia's belief in calm strength over loud anger. And it had reminded everyone who watched that true authority isn't about control, it's about humanity. In the end, there were no grand gestures, no dramatic closure, just two people quietly moving forward, each in their own way, carrying a lesson that would ripple far beyond themselves. And sometimes that was enough.